157. Who you callin' hysterical? 157.
I am not a crier. Seriously, I didn't even cry at Marley and Me, and I'm a dog person. So earlier this year when I first saw Nike's Dream Crazy campaign, I got emotional. All these female athletes with inspiring stories about taking on the patriarchy in sports, now that should have been the plot of Marley and Me. But at its core, as the New York Times on February 26, 2019 notes, the ads are really about something more. Women reclaiming the word crazy. Which is why I was a little surprised when last month, track and field star and former Nike athlete Alicia Montano announced her plans to sue Nike. Because when she got pregnant, they stopped paying her. The reason? As the article explains, when you get pregnant, you get too emotional, too unpredictable, and even too crazy. Yet for literally thousands of years, we have been obsessed with what happens inside a woman's uterus and associated that with how she acts. And it all started with a term that many of us now take for granted: hysteria. As The Atlantic on March 24th, 2019 notes, hysteria was the first and most commonly diagnosed mental health disease in women and was recognized as a mental illness until 1980. However, Google Trends, Twitter, Reddit, and even Merriam-Webster's dictionary all showed that searches for female hysteria spiked up, while the women of the Me Too movement spoke out. Meaning, hysteria's impacts go far beyond a woman's uterus. So, today, we'll first examine the history of hysteria as a medical diagnosis. Second, look at how the evolution of hysteria on a small scale changed the religious and cultural landscape for women everywhere, before finally discussing the large-scale implications to what researchers at Columbia University on April 29th, 2019 called the most influential term in the history of marginalizing women for being women. One of my favorite things to do is to troll Twitter for idiots. Here's one of my personal favorites, at IamSteve29. Okay, the only thing I understand less than the hashtag Game of Thrones hysteria is the number of insane women in the show who just need to shut up and get a man. LOL. But hey, if you need a misogynistic photographer in Oklahoma, he does weddings. This relationship between hysteria and insanity has a long and complex history, stretching as far back as our history class's favorite philosopher, Aristotle. See, in ancient Greece, Aristotle firmly believed that women should not play a role in democracy, but he couldn't justify his opinion without something to back him up. So, he invented a disease: the wandering uterus, which was basically the belief that when a woman was overly emotional, her uterus must have left its usual spot and started wandering around the body, making her insane. But as Marquette University in November 2018 explains, we hardly ever hear about the wandering uterus because the term didn't sound medical enough to be believed. So Aristotle coined a new phrase, derived from the Greek word meaning uterus: hysteria. And that stuck. So much so that the Greeks and future civilizations in their wake believed that the uterus was responsible for everything that went wrong in a woman's body. So, their proposed cure: forcing women to have sex with men when they didn't want to. As Helen King writes in her book, Hippocrates' Women, this became the basis for using rape as punishment, and more importantly, laid the groundwork for normalizing rape and blaming women for being raped. In other words, as Medium argues on April 10th, 2018, the term hysteria made what we now know as rape culture possible. Symptoms of female hysteria often ranged from excessive nervousness to loss of interest in everyday activities, both of which we would probably characterize today as depression. But a few hundred years ago were signs of being a witch. In her book, Suspicion, Betrayal, and Hysteria, in 1692, historian Stacy Schiff points out that a medical diagnosis of hysteria that could not be cured through sex, that was like all of them, often meant the patient was told her uterus had been taken over by the devil. For many women, hysteria and witchcraft were inseparable, which, Schiff argues, marked the beginning of the feminization of madness we still see today. But notice something here that people who look like me take for granted. The witches are all white because hysteria was exclusively a white woman's disease. In her study, The Race of Hysteria, women's studies professor Laura Briggs highlights that for women of color, common symptoms of hysteria weren't concerning. They were considered normal. As a result, the medical community started using women of color for experiments, with brutal procedures on their uteruses to try and fix hysteria for white women. As the researchers note, this treatment became the blueprint for a long history of exploiting people of color in the name of medicine, from the Tuskegee syphilis experiments to Henrietta Lacks to the entire history of gynecology, leading the New Yorker of August 24th, 2018, to suggest that hysteria was the first instance of female bodies being used, not just as weapons against ourselves, but also against each other. But hey, it's okay, because we got rid of the official diagnosis and fixed everything. Only a short 300 years later. But not really. Hysteria set the stage for issues that we still see today. Women are 40% more likely than men to be diagnosed with a mental illness, 60% more likely to be prescribed mood-altering drugs, and 75% more likely to be diagnosed with emotional instability. And yet, on average, women have to see their doctors 4 times more than men before receiving a diagnosis, meaning we actually have to fight just to have our supposed craziness acknowledged at all. Finally, there is perhaps no better time to talk about the importance of hysteria than now. As the University of Toronto notes on February 20th, 2018, hysteria isn't just important for what it did diagnose, but also for what it didn't. Trauma. In the wake of hysteria, women's stories about actual physical trauma were ignored. So when a woman told her doctor she was harassed, assaulted, or raped, she was typically told it was all in her head. And as a society, we still haven't let that go. So much so that attorneys from court cases right here in this very state of Texas have argued that their male defendants who had committed acts of domestic violence against their wives were provoked because those women were on their periods, and so they were acting hysterical. Or, as the Duke University Law Journal puts it, the next insanity defense. complicated history of hysteria is essential in unpacking not only the female experience, but also in understanding the beginnings of a culture whose first response to women isn't, "Are you okay?" but rather, "Are you sure?" Sigmund Freud had a fun little pet name for hysteria: the suffocating uterus. And when he diagnosed hysteria, which was often, he placed a woman inside a glass room so that fellow doctors and patients could watch her, like entertainment. These two things together created a term we use, even in this activity, to describe a really funny round of HI. Hysterical. Something so funny, you can hardly breathe. Clearly, even today, hysteria's impacts are no more than a uterus away. But until we can acknowledge the complicated history of hysteria and all it represents, then the message of Nike's Dream Crazy commercial will be just that: a dream.